Everyone.
Morning.
So as Mark has already said, today is Father's Day. And it's a day which can be quite a joyful time for some people, but also acknowledge it can also be a difficult time for others. Some of us may remember a loving father. Some of us may carry grief or disappointment or have memories of complicated relationships. Some may have never had children, but they have, as men, profoundly shaped the lives of others. So this morning, as we celebrate our menfolk, as we celebrate and remember that today is Father's Day, it's very usual on such a day to actually sort of focus on the fatherhood of God. And we know that God is our Father, but I'm not going to do that this morning. What I would like us to do this morning is to actually look at Abraham. Now, he was the father of many nations, hence the link. But also as well, it's recently in our home group, we did a study on Abraham, and it's been playing on my mind for a while. And this is why I felt when it worked out that Mark and I were going to do the service together, I thought, you know what, I'm going to talk about Abraham. But I want us to think about influence, about faithfulness, and about legacy. Now, whether we're fathers or mothers, grandparents, single people, we're all travelling a road, and we're building something with our lives, and we're leaving something behind. So let's hear now from Paul as he brings us the reading from Genesis chapter 12, which is the beginning of Abraham's journey. Thanks, Paul.
Genesis chapters 12, verses 1 to 9. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's households to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram travelled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued towards the Negev. This is God's word.
Thank you, Paul. Who here, hands up, who here has ever had to pack for a journey, a trip, without knowing where you were going? Is anybody? Pete has. I saw Trish give him an elbow. So not many of us. I can't say whether I have. I don't think I haven't that. But that's exactly the place that Abraham found himself in. At this time, he was known as Abram. God said to him, "Go from your country, your people, your father's household, to the land I will show you." Can you just imagine, ladies, if your husband said that to you, that this is what we were doing? Can you imagine the conversation that Abraham must have had with Sarai, his wife? "Where are we going, Abraham?" No idea. "How long is it going to take?" No idea. "What do I need to take?" Who knows? God asked Abram to leave everything that provided security. He had to leave his country, his extended family, his culture, and everything that was familiar. It would have been very easy for Abraham not to go, because there was no detailed itinerary, there was no map, there was no timeline. It was just, go to the land I will show you. Talk about going without knowing. Now, this is the beginning of Abraham's journey of faith. God has invited him into a relationship of trust, and Abraham obeyed, and he went, trusting God. Now, this is how faith works. We, humans, we would like to know everything before going. We want to know the path. We want to know what's coming next. But very often, God, he is asking us to go without knowing. It's a pattern that we see in other parts of Scripture. If you think about, remember, Noah, he ended up building the ark before he ever saw the rain. You had Moses stepping into leadership before he felt ready. And the disciples left their nets before they fully understood who Jesus truly was. They went without knowing. Now, God made Abraham a promise. He says, we heard, I will bless you. God's blessing you. God was going to be with him. But he also said, you will be a blessing. So others are going to benefit too. And those promises are very much for us as well. God says to us, I'll bless you. And he also says, you will be a blessing. But sometimes we have to go without knowing for that to happen. So God still calls you and me as individuals, and he calls us as a church as well to go, to trust, and to bless others. We may not know what God is saying. We may not know what he's saying next, our next step. But he is saying, come with me, trust me. Now, some of us here may have had experience of or know something about obeying in a trusting way. Maybe, a move to a new place, or caring for a family member without knowing what tomorrow is going to hold. Maybe walking through illness or grief or uncertainty. Possibly stepping into ministry, leadership or service, feeling inadequate. I can remember many years ago, God leading Mark and myself and our children from London. And it was a time where we had a real sense of God leading us. At the time when the decision was made, we didn't know where we were going to live. We didn't know we were moving up here. We started looking around the outskirts of London, moving a bit further north, and then a bit further north, and we ended up, God leading us to where we are now in Winthrop. And finding the home, finding a school for the children, that happened quite quickly and quite easily in a way. But the one thing that we really struggled with, and we had to just trust God, one step at a time, was actually, where were we going to worship? What church are we going to go to? I remember at the time thinking, because God had led us and I had this sense that God was leading us and we were just going step by step, it was going to be very easy to find a church. Oh no, it wasn't. It took many months for us. It wasn't all plain sailing, and we had to really trust God as we stepped out. And eventually, months later, we ended up coming here. And the rest, as they say, is history. But today, for us as a church, as well as individuals, is God calling us to step out in faith? Is he calling us to start something new? Maybe to talk to someone, to say yes to something where we may have to be a bit brave, or to follow him into an unfamiliar place. Abraham didn't know where he was going, yet he went, because his confidence was in God. Abram was going to keep on travelling through uncertainty. And we can actually see in the passage that Paul read to us what actually anchored him, what kept him going. I'm going to be looking at that. It's building altars. And it's the same for us today. What keeps us going as we step out in faith? It's building altars. But before we consider that, I want us to spend some time in worship, because worship is key with building altars. I'm going to hand over to Linda and her team to lead us now as we worship God, the one who calls us and the one who is always with us. And during this time, we will take up the offering. And I'm going to ask, when the offering bag comes round, can we pass the bag to each other? I know that a lot of people pay through the banks and things, don't put cash in. But just by taking the bag and passing it on, it's uniting us, because we're here together worshipping. And it's letting God know, yeah, I'm giving myself to you, Lord. I'm wanting to trust you. Thank you, Linda. So building altars. A recurring theme, really, with Abraham, with his life, as you look at it. And we actually see it a couple of times in the passage that Paul read to us from Genesis 12. Building altars was something that Abraham did. We read earlier, verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abraham, and Abraham built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord. In verse 8, from there he went on toward the hills of Bethel. There he built another altar to the Lord and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshipped the Lord. In the next chapter, chapter 13, if you were to read that, it says there about Abraham, they travelled by stages toward Bethel and pitched their tents where they'd camped before. This was the same place where Abraham had built the altar, and there he worshipped the Lord again. And later on in that chapter, so Abraham moved his camp to Hebron. There he built another altar to the Lord. Lots of altars. When God appeared to Abraham, he built an altar. When he reached a new place, he built an altar. When he returns after wandering, he returned to the altar. Now, it's been said that Abraham's life can be summarized with two words: tents and altars. Tents remind us that Abraham was a traveller. Nothing was permanent, nothing was settled. But wherever he pitched his tent, he built an altar. Now, this is significant. His circumstances may have changed, but his devotion to God hasn't. His location may change, but his worship doesn't. His future may be uncertain, but his commitment to God remained. The tents tell us that Abraham belonged nowhere permanently, but the altars tell us who Abraham belonged to. Now, we no longer pile up stones to build an altar. We don't do that. But we do still need altars. Do you have times when you deliberately pause and remember who God is? Do you have places and habits where you remember God? They are our altars. We build our altars when we intentionally set apart a space, a time, a practice, a moment to meet with God, to remember his faithfulness, and a time to surrender ourselves to him and possibly renew our covenant relationship with him. With Abraham, we see his altars, and therefore I would say our altars, as times of worship, of honouring God and acknowledging his presence. A time of remembrance, marking significant encounters, promises, or acts of God's faithfulness. The altars are a time of dedication when we can express our commitment and our surrender to God. And also a time of prayer and communion, creating a focal point for seeking God's guidance. They are our altars. Now, Abraham, through him, he teaches us that worship is not something that is squeezed into life when it's convenient. It is what sustains us during the journey. The second part of Genesis chapter 12 is quite interesting. We're not going to look at it now, but I do suggest that you actually read it. Because in that second part of that chapter, we see Abraham messing up. He really does mess up. But after coming out of that experience, what does he do? I read the verse earlier. He actually returned to the place where he had built an altar before, and he called on the Lord, and he worshipped. So spiritually, for us today, building an altar means creating a deliberate point of worship, remembrance, surrender, and communion with God that marks his presence and his faithfulness in our lives. Many years ago, some of you who hit there, Mark and I ran a discipleship course called Experiencing God. Some of you may remember doing it. But during that course, we were encouraged to record those significant, if you like, God times. Times that were important, times when we saw God's faithfulness, times when God answered prayer, times when we had a real sense of God with us. And I would say that is a practice that is very much worth doing, even today. Because when things get difficult, when we have those times where we're not sure if God is there or if God is listening to us, we can go back and look at those God times, and we can remind ourselves of his promises and his faithfulness. As a church, we can do that. The times when it's difficult, when we're thinking, are we ever going to get a minister? Other times, we maybe feel that we're struggling. I would say, people, remind each other of those God times. Because we see God's leading. We're reminded of his leading. We're reminded of the time he answered prayer. We're reminded of his faithfulness. Barry, do you remember those times with the mix on a Friday night? Just you and me and 50-odd teenagers. You know, we say we don't want to look back. It's not good to look back. But you know what? I disagree with that. It is good to look back. Not because, with the mix, Barry, don't look back at that and think, wow, wouldn't it be great to have those kids here again? No. Looking back and remembering, gosh, week after week, God was faithful. God protected us. We never had any trouble. God was there. God was present. God was faithful. So as a church, let's encourage each other and remind each other of those times, those altars. Just reminded, look back at those and remember. Because like Abraham, we can then say, God met me there, or God met us as a church there. And we want to remember, we want to worship, and we want to respond. So I encourage you to do that. But for yourself, if you don't do it already, start making a note of those times when you have seen God working, when he's answered prayer, when you've had a real sense of him with you. Because it's good when it's difficult to look back and remember. Abraham went back to his altar. He remembered God's faithfulness and God's leading, and his trust and his faith in God was renewed. Communion is an important part of building altars. the communion table is set before us. It is a repeated act of remembrance, but it is a repeated act of remembrance that actually anchors us as a church in God's work. So we are going to spend some time now around the communion table. And as we lead into that, Mark is going to lead us, but Linda's going to, and the team will lead us in a song to help us prepare. Thank you, Linda. Abraham's journey, one of going without knowing, a journey above building altars. What's his legacy? When we hear the word legacy, we tend to think of money, possessions, property, achievements, success. But God thinks differently. The most important things that we pass on are often things that can't be measured. Our character, our values, our faith, our integrity, our compassion, our trust in God. God told Abraham, "You will be a blessing." Think of all the people who travelled with him. When Abraham obeyed God, when he went without knowing, other people saw it. Sarai saw it, his wife, the servants saw it, the household saw it. The people around him watched him dismantle his life and move towards God's promise. They saw in Abraham a man who obeyed when he didn't have all the answers. They saw him build altars and worship when circumstances were uncertain. They saw him return to God after messing up. They saw not a perfect man, but a faithful one. And don't you think that would have had an effect on their lives? Now, certainly we know Abraham, he becomes the father of a great nation. But you know what? That is not his legacy. We read about his legacy in Hebrews chapter 11. Verses 8 to 9, it says, "It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith." Abraham's greatest legacy is faith. Now, our faith is never private, as much as we may want it to be, but it's not. Because people observe how we live. They see how we respond to uncertainty, and they watch how we cope and handle disappointments. Often our greatest testimony comes not from what we say, from our explanations, but actually from our responses to things. People may forget our words, may forget what we say, but they will remember how we live. So what's our legacy? What are we leaving behind? Will we, as individuals, be remembered as somebody who trusted God? Will we be remembered as someone who built spiritual foundations? Are we being remembered and being seen as one who pointed beyond ourselves and pointed to God? And what about us as a church, SBC? What's our church's legacy? How do we want our church to be remembered? What do we want our church to be remembered for? Looking at Abraham, we see three simple but very important truths. Go without knowing. We may not know every detail of ours and our church's future. We may not have all the answers. But God calls us to trust him with the next step. Secondly, we need to build altars, to create rhythms of worship, prayer and remembrance, because it's those altars that anchor our life in God. Don't allow our journey of faith to become such that we forget the one who has called us. And thirdly, we need to leave a legacy of faith, a legacy of trust, a legacy of worship. Let others see in us a life that trusts God, a life that returns to God at times, a life that consistently points to God. Let others see a church that trusts God, that responds to the faithfulness of God, and consistently points to God. Because of the way that Abraham lived, generations after him were blessed. May God help us to travel faithfully with our journey of faith. May he help us to worship consistently. And may he help us leave behind a legacy that encourages others to also trust him.